pristine pearl white luxury SUV was sitting completely stranded on a tiny dirt island, surrounded by a freshly dug 4-foot trench, while the HOA president in her crisp white tennis shoes screamed at me across the gap. She was waving her plastic clipboard like a weapon, demanding I fill the hole immediately, while my neighbor Elias and I just sat on the tailgate of my truck eating sunflower seeds and drinking black coffee. She genuinely thought her little neighborhood title gave her the absolute right to park her patrol vehicle directly in front of my heavy metal farm gate, and she was about 5 seconds away from trying to jump that trench to prove it. My name is Arthur. I'm 58 years old, and my family has been running cattle on this dirt long before they built a cookie-cutter subdivision next door. I tried being polite, I tried putting up bright red signs, and I even tried warning her about the property lines. But before I show you how a specialized heavy recovery crane had to airlift her vehicle out of my mud, let me tell you how this absurd war started. Because you should never bring a clipboard to a tractor fight. My family has owned this dirt for 90 years. We grow hay. We run a few head of cattle. It is quiet, honest, bone-tiring work. The kind of work that leaves dirt beneath your fingernails that no amount of scrubbing will ever completely wash away. For the better part of a century, the only sounds you could hear on this land were the wind coming through the valley, the low rumble of a tractor engine, and the occasional bark of a farm dog chasing a shadow. It was peaceful. Then came the developers. They bought the massive stretch of empty pasture right next to my eastern fence line. For 2 solid years, my life was a symphony of diesel excavators, nail guns, and backup alarms. They stripped the topsoil, paved over the wild grass, and slapped up exactly 85 identical, aggressively beige houses. They named this new monument to suburban sprawl Whispering Pines. There are no pines anywhere within a 20-mile radius. The wind does not whisper through the vinyl siding. It was a cookie-cutter neighborhood built for people who want the aesthetic of living in the country without having to ever look at actual dirt. And with the new neighborhood came the Homeowners Association. And with the Homeowners Association came Brenda. Brenda was the newly elected president of the Whispering Pines HOA. I had never officially met her, but I knew exactly who she was. You could not miss her. She drove a pristine, pearl-white luxury crossover SUV that looked like it had never been driven in the rain, let alone on a country road. She patrolled her new kingdom every morning. She wore pastel tennis skirts, oversized designer sunglasses that covered half her face, and a crisp white visor. She did not play tennis. There was no tennis court in Whispering Pines. The outfit was entirely tactical. It let everyone know she was active, she was moving, and she had places to be. She also carried a thick plastic clipboard with a silver clip. She wielded that clipboard like a medieval broadsword. I used to watch her from my porch while I drank my morning coffee. My 12-year-old hound dog, Buster, would sit by my boots, letting out a low grunt every time Brenda marched past our property line. She would stop in front of her neighbors' houses, stare at their lawns, make a dramatic sigh that you could practically hear across the pasture, and furiously scribble on her clipboard. She was a woman who thrived on minor infractions. She was the queen of the beige castle. I did not care what she did on her side of the property line. I really did not. If those people wanted to pay $300 a month for the privilege of having a woman in a visor measure their grass with a plastic ruler, that was their business. I just wanted to be left alone to run my farm. But Brenda had a problem. The streets in Whispering Pines were narrow. The developers had maximized the lot space, which meant the roads barely had enough room for 2 cars to pass each other, let alone park. And Brenda, in her infinite dedication to neighborhood surveillance, needed to patrol the back fence line. She needed to make sure no unauthorized sheds were being built, no unapproved shades of beige were being painted, and no rogue garden gnomes were being displayed in the backyards facing my farm. To do this, she needed a place to park her pearl-white SUV. My farm has a long, unpaved access road that runs directly parallel to the brick wall separating my property from the subdivision. It is my road. It is entirely on my deed. I use it to move my heavy equipment from the front barn to the back pastures without having to drive out onto the county highway. It is private property. It is clearly marked with signs. On a Tuesday morning in early September, I drove my old yellow work truck down to the back pasture to check on a broken fence post. As I rounded the corner, I hit the brakes. Sitting dead center in the middle of my dirt access road, blocking my heavy metal gate, was the gleaming white SUV. I put my truck in park. I left the engine running. The dust swirled around my tires and settled onto the hood of her spotless car. I looked around. There was no one in sight. I honked the horn. A short, polite beep. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes. I honked again a little longer this time. Still nothing. I climbed out of the truck. Buster hopped out of the passenger side, sniffed the tires of the SUV, and lifted his leg. I gently nudged him away. We do not vandalize, even when we are annoyed. I leaned against the hood of my truck and folded my arms. 20 minutes later, I saw the white tennis visor bobbing along the top of the brick wall. Brenda came marching around the corner, holding her clipboard against her chest. Trailing right behind her was a man I later learned was named Gary. Gary was the HOA vice president. He wore a polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts and looked like a man who spent his entire life apologizing for things he did not do. Brenda did not look apologetic. She looked annoyed that I was standing near her vehicle. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You are blocking my access gate. I need to get my truck through." Brenda stopped. She looked at my boots. She looked at my faded denim jacket. She looked at Buster, who was busy scratching his ear. Then she looked at my truck. She let out a long, theatrical sigh. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a key fob, and unlocked the car. But she did not get in. "I am conducting official association business," she said. Her voice was sharp, clipped, and incredibly loud for someone standing 10 feet away. "We are doing our quarterly perimeter inspection. I will be moving in a few moments. You can wait." She actually held up one finger, a perfectly manicured, aggressively pink fingernail. She pointed it right at my face. "Ma'am," I said, "this is a working farm. This is private property. You cannot park here." She adjusted her sunglasses. "This is an unpaved service lane. It is adjacent to our community wall. We have an implied easement for neighborhood maintenance. I suggest you check with the county before you try to threaten me." I stared at her. I did not threaten her. I just asked her to move. An implied easement? That is not even a real legal term. She had just strung 3 important-sounding words together and threw them at me like pocket sand. Let me stop right here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone is so profoundly, confidently wrong that your brain actually short-circuits for a second? If you know that exact feeling of staring at an entitled brick wall, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Because it was in that very moment, looking at her pink fingernails shining in the morning sun, that I realized patience was not going to work with this woman. "There is no easement," I said quietly. "Move the car." She rolled her eyes, turned to Gary, and whispered something. Gary looked at the ground. Brenda climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and reversed all the way down my dirt road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. She did not wave. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. I assumed she would realize she was in the wrong and find another place to park. I underestimated the sheer, unfiltered stubbornness of a neighborhood dictator. 3 days later, I went down to check the mail at the end of the long driveway. Mixed in with the farm supply catalogs and the electric bill was a crisp white envelope. The return address was the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I opened it. It was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. It was a formal notice of violation. The letter stated that the dust generated by my farming equipment was blowing over the brick wall and settling onto the patio furniture of the premium lots. It cited a neighborhood bylaw regarding airborne nuisances. It demanded that I suppress the dust by watering down my dirt roads twice a day, or I would face a fine of $150 per incident. I stood by the mailbox and read the letter 3 times. I do not live in Whispering Pines. My farm is not part of their association. They have 0 legal jurisdiction over my land. It was like the local bowling alley sending a fine to a grocery store for having slippery floors. It was absolute, unadulterated nonsense. I walked back to the house, struck a match, and used the heavy cardstock to start the fire in my wood stove. It burned beautifully. The following week, the white SUV was back. I was out in the tractor cutting a field of alfalfa. From the elevated cab, I had a perfect view of the access road. Brenda was parked in the exact same spot, blocking my gate. This time, she had set up a folding chair on my dirt road. She was sitting in it, drinking out of a metal thermos, watching a crew of landscapers trim the bushes on her side of the wall. I killed the tractor engine. I climbed down and walked the 1/4 mile across the field. My neighbor, Elias, was out fixing his fence line on the adjoining property. Elias is a man of very few words. He wears overalls that have been washed so many times they are practically gray. He saw me walking toward the access road, saw Brenda in her folding chair, and simply leaned his chin on his post-hole digger to watch. He did not say a word. His silence spoke volumes. I walked up to the gate. "Brenda," I said. She did not look away from the landscapers. "I'm busy," she said. "You are trespassing," I said. "I'm going to put up signs. If you park here again, I will have this vehicle towed." She finally turned her head. She lowered her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, using that slow, condescending tone people use when talking to a lost tourist. "I spoke with our neighborhood attorney. Because our wall borders your property, we have a legal right of way to maintain our infrastructure. If you touch my car, I will sue you for damages. I will sue you for harassment, and I will have my attorney look into the zoning of your little farm operation. Do we understand each other?" She took a sip from her thermos. She looked so incredibly proud of herself. I looked at her. I looked at Elias, who was still leaning on his post-hole digger. Elias raised his eyebrows and took a slow bite of an apple he had pulled from his pocket. "All right," I said. I turned around and walked away. I did not yell. I did not argue. The calmer you are with people like Brenda, the more it unnerves them. She expected a screaming match. I gave her silence. The next day, I drove into town and bought 4 metal signs, bright red and white. No parking. Private property. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. I mounted them on heavy wooden posts and drove them deep into the dirt along the access road. I spaced them exactly 50 feet apart. You could not miss them. 2 days later, she parked directly in front of the second sign. It was time to make the call. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and looked up the number for the local towing company. A guy named Mike answered the phone. Mike is a good guy. He has pulled my truck out of the mud twice over the last decade. "Mike," I said, "I need a vehicle removed from my property. It is parked on a private agricultural road, actively blocking a farm gate. It is fully signed." "No problem," Mike said, over the noise of a garage in the background. "Give me the make, model, and plates." "It is a pearl white luxury crossover SUV, Whispering Pines, HOA, President." The line went dead silent. The background noise of the garage seemed to fade away. "Mike?" I asked. Mike let out a heavy sigh. "Buddy," he said, "is it Brenda's car?" "You know her?" "Everybody in the towing business knows her," Mike said. His voice sounded tired. "I towed her car last year. She parked in a marked fire lane in front of the grocery store because she didn't want to walk in the rain. I hooked her up and hauled her off. She dragged my company into small claims court. She filed complaints with the state licensing board. She called my office every day for 3 months, threatening to ruin my business. She claimed the tow chain scratched her bumper, even though we used nylon straps. She is a nightmare. I am sorry, my friend, I really am. But I cannot afford the legal headache of touching that woman's car. Mike, she is on my private land. I know, Mike said. Call the sheriff, get them to ticket her. But my drivers are not touching that shiny white nightmare. Good luck. He hung up the phone. I put the receiver down. I took a sip of my coffee. Buster walked into the kitchen, sat on my foot, and looked up at me with his big, sad hound eyes. He grunted. I know, buddy, I told him. We have a problem. Calling the sheriff was an option, sure. But county deputies are stretched thin out here. It takes them hours to respond to non-emergency calls. By the time a deputy showed up, Brenda would be done with her patrols and back in her beige castle. A ticket would not solve the problem. She would just pay it out of the HOA funds and keep doing it. I needed her to stop. I needed her to physically understand that her clipboard had no power on this side of the brick wall. I walked out to the back porch and looked out over the fields. The rainy season was coming in a few weeks. The ground was getting soft. I looked at the long dirt access road. I looked at the signs. Then I remembered something. I walked over to the shed and pulled out the master topographical map of the farm. My grandfather had drawn it by hand 50 years ago. I traced the blue ink lines with my finger. The main agricultural drainage ditch ran across the back pasture and flowed directly toward the access road. The county water board had actually sent me a notice a few months prior recommending I widen the drainage trenches to prevent flooding along the property line. I looked at the map. I looked at the spot where Brenda always parked. The drainage ditch needed to run exactly right through her favorite parking spot. I folded the map. I smiled. It was a very quiet, very cold smile. The next morning was a Wednesday. I woke up at 5 o'clock. I drank my coffee. I fed Buster. I walked out to the equipment shed and stood in front of my John Deere backhoe. It is not a new machine. The yellow paint is faded, the seat is patched with duct tape, and it smells strongly of diesel grease and old earth. But it runs like a dream. I fired up the engine. It roared to life, coughing a puff of black smoke into the crisp morning air. The heavy diesel vibration rattled right through my boots. I raised the front bucket. I backed it out of the shed and drove it slowly across the pasture toward the access road. I parked the backhoe behind a cluster of oak trees and killed the engine. Then I waited. At exactly 8:30, the pearl white SUV turned the corner and drove down my dirt road. Brenda pulled right up to the heavy metal gate, parked directly in front of my bright red no parking sign, and turned off the engine. She stepped out of the car. She was wearing a light blue polo shirt today with pristine white tennis shoes. Gary was waiting for her on the other side of the brick wall. She grabbed her clipboard, locked the car, and walked through the pedestrian gap in the wall to begin her morning patrol on the subdivision side. I watched her disappear down the street. She would be gone for at least an hour. She always was. I climbed back into the cab of the backhoe. I turned the key. The engine roared. I drove the heavy machine out from behind the trees and positioned it directly behind her SUV. I dropped the front bucket to the ground to stabilize the tractor. I spun my seat around to face the rear digging arm. I grabbed the dual hydraulic levers. There is an art to operating a backhoe. It is not just about tearing up dirt. It is about precision. You have to feel the weight of the earth in the bucket. You have to know exactly where the teeth are going to bite. I lowered the heavy steel arm. The metal teeth of the bucket bit into the soft earth exactly 4 feet behind Brenda's rear bumper. I pulled the lever toward me. The hydraulics whined a beautiful high-pitched mechanical song. The bucket curled inward, scooping up a massive, heavy load of dark brown farm dirt. I swung the arm to the left and dumped the dirt into a neat pile along the fence line. I moved the bucket back. I took another scoop and another. Within 10 minutes, I had dug a trench 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep directly behind her car. I lifted the front bucket, drove the tractor forward a few feet, and repositioned. I swung the arm around to the driver's side of her SUV. This was the tricky part. I had to get close enough to trap the car, but I could not risk a single rock or clump of dirt touching her precious paint job. If I scratched her car, she would have a legitimate legal claim against me. I had to be surgical. I lowered the bucket. I dug the side trench. I left exactly 24 inches of undisturbed dirt between her tires and the edge of the pit. 2 feet of clearance. That was it. I scooped, swung, and dumped. The smell of freshly turned earth filled the air. It is a rich, dark smell. The smell of hard work. I worked my way entirely around the vehicle, down the driver's side, across the front bumper, down the passenger side. It took me 45 minutes of steady, concentrated work. When I finally killed the engine and raised the arm, I climbed out of the cab to admire my handiwork. It was a masterpiece. The pearl-white luxury SUV was sitting on an island. There was a continuous 4-foot deep, 4-foot wide trench completely encircling the vehicle. The walls of the trench were sheer drops of soft, crumbly dirt. The massive piles of excavated earth formed a barricade on the outside of the moat. The vehicle was perfectly unharmed, not a speck of dirt on the paint, but it was completely, undeniably trapped. The only way to reach the door handles was to leap across a 4-foot canyon of loose farm soil. Elias pulled his truck up to his side of the fence. He turned off his engine. He stepped out, walked over to the wire fence, and rested his forearms on the top rail. He looked at the trench. He looked at the gleaming white car sitting on its little dirt pedestal. Elias reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of sunflower seeds, and popped them into his mouth. He chewed slowly. "You think she's a good jumper?" Elias asked quietly. "We are about to find out," I replied. I walked over to the bed of my pickup truck, dropped the tailgate, and sat down. Buster wandered over, sniffed the edge of the newly dug trench, sneezed, and came to sit beside me. I poured a fresh cup of coffee from my thermos. The trap was set. The moat was dug. I could see the white visor bobbing in the distance as she marched back down the subdivision street toward the access road. If you are enjoying this little lesson in rural engineering and boundary enforcement, make sure you hit subscribe and leave a comment, because you are absolutely not going to want to miss the look on this woman's face when she realizes what just happened. Brenda marched through the pedestrian gap in the brick wall. Gary was trailing a few steps behind her, looking at a stack of papers. Brenda was looking at her clipboard, making a final furious note with her pen. She did not look up until she was standing at the edge of my access road. She took one step forward. Her pristine white tennis shoe hit the edge of the excavated dirt pile. She stopped. She slowly lowered the clipboard. She took off her oversized sunglasses. She blinked. She looked at her car. She looked at the 4-foot drop. She looked at the massive piles of dirt. She looked at the 2-foot island her vehicle was currently resting on. Then, she looked at me. I was sitting on my tailgate, sipping my coffee. Elias was leaning on the fence, eating sunflower seeds. The silence stretched for a long, beautiful 10 seconds. The only sound was the wind coming through the valley. "Morning," I said. Brenda exploded. I have never heard a human being make the sound she made. It was a cross between a screech owl and a tea kettle. Her face turned a shade of crimson that clashed terribly with her light blue polo shirt. "What is this?" she shrieked. "What have you done to my vehicle, you maniac, you absolute lunatic?" "Just doing some scheduled agricultural maintenance," I said calmly. I gestured toward the trench with my coffee mug. "Water runoff has been a real issue lately. The county suggested I widen my drainage ditches, doing my part for the local environment." "You trapped my car!" she screamed, waving the clipboard in my direction. "You intentionally dug a hole around my car." "You parked in the exact path of the new drainage route," I replied. "I put signs up. I told you this was a working farm." Gary stepped up next to her. He looked at the trench. He looked at the backhoe. He looked at me. Gary swallowed hard and took half a step backward. "Move this dirt right now," Brenda commanded. She was shaking with rage. "Get in that tractor and fill this hole immediately, or I am calling the police and having you arrested for domestic terrorism." Elias snorted. He actually laughed out loud. He spit a sunflower seed shell into the grass. I took another sip of my coffee. "I would love to help you out, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft. But you are currently parked in an active construction zone. OSHA safety regulations clearly state that I cannot operate heavy machinery within 10 feet of an unauthorized vehicle. It is a liability issue. My hands are tied. Brenda stared at me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked back at her car. The pearl-white paint was gleaming in the sun, mocking her. She walked around the perimeter of the trench, trying to find a weak point. There was none. I had dug it uniformly. It was 4 feet wide all the way around. "I'm getting in my car," she announced to the universe. Gary reached out a hand. "Brenda, I don't think that is a good idea. The dirt looks loose." "Shut up, Gary," Brenda snapped. She backed up 3 paces. She was going to jump it. Now let me paint this picture for you. Brenda is not an athlete. Brenda is a woman who considers walking briskly with a clipboard to be peak physical exertion. She was wearing flat, smooth-bottomed white tennis shoes, and the dirt on the edge of the trench was freshly excavated topsoil. It was soft, crumbly, and completely unstable. She ran forward. She leapt. She actually got decent distance. She cleared the 4-foot gap, but the problem was not the distance. The problem was the landing. Her crisp white shoes hit the 2-foot dirt island right next to her driver's side door. The moment her weight transferred to the edge of the island, the soft dirt simply gave way. It sheared off like an avalanche. She did not stick the landing. Brenda let out a short, terrified gasp as the ground vanished beneath her feet. Her arms flailed in a desperate windmill motion. She tried to grab the door handle of her SUV, but her fingers just squeaked down the polished paint. She slid backward, feet first, right down into the 4-foot trench. She landed squarely on her backside in the loose, dark farm soil. A cloud of brown dust puffed up into the air around her. Her thick plastic clipboard flew from her hands and landed upside down in the mud. Papers scattered everywhere. Her crisp white tennis shoes were instantly caked in thick, dark dirt. The pastel blue polo shirt was smeared with brown streaks. She was sitting in the bottom of the ditch, completely silent. Elias took off his hat and wiped his forehead. "Well," Elias said mildly, "she is not a good jumper." By this point, the commotion had attracted a crowd. 6 residents from Whispering Pines had wandered down the street and were now standing at the pedestrian gap in the brick wall. They were watching their HOA president sit in a dirt hole. None of them offered to help. A few of them were actively trying to hide their smiles. Gary was staring at the sky, pretending to be very interested in the cloud formations. Brenda slowly crawled out of the ditch on her hands and knees. She looked like a creature emerging from a swamp. Her visor was crooked. Her clothes were ruined. She stood up, brushed a massive clump of mud off her pants, and pulled her cell phone from her pocket with a shaking, filthy hand. She dialed the sheriff. It took 30 minutes for Deputy Miller to arrive. Miller is a good old boy who grew up in the next county over. He pulled his cruiser up to the gate, stepped out, and took a long look at the situation. He looked at the pristine car on the island. He looked at the massive trench. He looked at Brenda, who was covered head to toe in agricultural dirt. Deputy Miller had to turn his back to us for a solid 30 seconds. His shoulders were shaking. When he finally composed himself and turned back around, his face was locked into a stern, professional mask, but his eyes were bright red. "All right," Miller said, resting his hand on his duty belt. "Can someone tell me what exactly is going on here?" Brenda stepped forward, pointing a muddy finger at me. "Arrest him!" she yelled. "He trapped my vehicle. He destroyed my clothes. This is an unprovoked attack on a community leader." Miller pulled out his notepad. He walked over to the edge of the trench. He looked down. He looked at the red, "No parking" signs. "Ma'am," Miller said slowly, "is this your vehicle?" "Yes." "And you parked it here, past the signs that clearly say private property?" "We have an implied easement," Brenda insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. Miller shook his head. "No, ma'am, you do not. This is an active agricultural parcel. It is private land. You are trespassing." "He trapped my car." "He dug a drainage ditch on his own property," Miller corrected her. "He has every right to move dirt on his own land. The real question is why your vehicle was parked in the path of a scheduled excavation." Brenda stared at him. She looked at the crowd of her neighbors watching her. She looked at Gary, who immediately took a step backward. She looked down at her ruined white shoes. "So, what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice finally dropping its arrogant edge. She sounded defeated. "Well," Miller said, putting his notepad away, "you're going to have to get it towed out of there. And since you are trespassing on private property, I am going to have to write you a citation. I would suggest you call a specialized recovery company. A regular tow truck cannot reach over that trench." It took her 3 hours to find a company willing to come out. Because the car was sitting on an island and surrounded by a trench, a standard tow truck was useless. They had to call in a heavy-duty recovery crane from the city. The arrival of the crane turned the afternoon into a neighborhood event. At least 20 people from the subdivision brought lawn chairs down to the wall. They sat and watched. Elias walked back to his house and returned with a thermos of sweet tea. We sat on the tailgate of my truck and enjoyed the show. The crane operators had to carefully extend a massive boom arm over the trench. They had to climb down into the dirt, secure nylon lifting straps under the chassis of the white SUV, and slowly hoist it straight up into the air. The pearl-white car dangled 30 feet above the farm, spinning slightly in the breeze before being gently lowered onto the flatbed of the recovery truck. The crane operator handed Brenda a clipboard to sign the invoice. It was a beautiful moment of irony. I could not see the exact total from where I was sitting, but Mike from the local tow yard told me later that a specialized crane lift like that costs over $2,500. Brenda signed the paper. She did not look at me. She did not look at her neighbors. She climbed into the passenger seat of the tow truck, and they drove away. 2 days later, Brenda formally resigned as the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. A letter was circulated to the neighborhood, stating she was stepping down because the community lacked the vision to appreciate her leadership. Gary took over as president. Gary does not carry a clipboard. Gary does not wear a visor. When Gary drives past the farm, he gives a polite little wave and keeps his car firmly on the paved roads. I never filled in the trench. I laid some corrugated plastic piping in the bottom of the ditch, covered the edges with gravel, and let the water flow. It works perfectly. The runoff drains beautifully down the property line. Sometimes, early in the morning, when the fog is still hanging low over the fields, I stand out by the fence line with a fresh cup of black coffee. I look out at that deep, beautiful, permanent ditch. Buster wanders over, grunts, and leans his heavy weight against my boots. The farm is quiet. The developers stay on their side of the brick wall, and my dirt road belongs exactly to who it is supposed to.